All right, hello and good morning to welcome to Patristicast. Today I'm very delighted to welcome to the first episode of Scholars Forum in probably over a month, Dr. Inbar Graiver. I tried my best. I don't know how I did it, but
it's good enough.
Okay. Inbar is a postdoctoral scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Freie Universität in Berlin. You've published quite a bit on asceticism, and today we're going to be talking about your book, Asceticism of the Mind, a fascinating book that I think is actually of interest not just to scholars of early monasticism, but anybody interested in cognitive neuroscience and the history of it. I think would even find some benefit from this. Those early monks might have actually some things to tell us about how the mind works.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Yeah.
Dr. Graiver, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I want to say before we start, this is the first episode to be filmed in my new location. I'm not in Toronto anymore. I'm in this major metropolis called Alexandria.
Really?
Minnesota. 13,000 people. We don't have a major museum. We don't have the intellectual heritage of the ancient Alexandrian Egypt, but we do have a giant statue of a Viking, Oli, we call them, and a giant rock with what are supposed to be Viking runes inscribed on them from, I don't know, I think the 13 or 1400s, but most people think that they're not authentic. So, but who knows? That's the Alexandria where I am. That's where I grew up. Just to tie in a connection with the material today. So, to get us started, I'm going to read the first two sentences, and I think that'll kind of set the atmosphere. Quote, Christian asceticism assumes that it is possible for a human being to acquire special powers by a process of inner development with the cooperation of divine aid. While realizing this potential to its full may have been reserved for a precious few, asceticism in the Eastern monastic tradition is based on the assumption that a profound self-transformation can take place in any individual who applies himself or herself with enough determination and faith. That is the basic assumption behind Christian asceticism, you say, that we can be transformed through training, albeit to a limited extent. Perfection can't necessarily be reached, but certain degrees of personal transformation can be attained.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it will be correct to say this very generally about Christian asceticism in general, but I do think it is true about certain traditions within Christianity, including the Eastern monastic tradition. Yeah.
Okay. So asceticism, the term. So let's define that. Most of the scholars will know what it means, but assuming there are non-academics watching who don't know what asceticism means, can you tell us a little bit about the term, where it comes from and what it means?
Yeah, well, so actually asceticism is a multifaceted phenomenon, and it appears in various contexts and forms. So no simple definition of asceticism, and actually it's there's no scholarly consensus even about such a definition. So on the one hand, we have these broad definitions of asceticism and its function within human culture, and they see it as a necessary condition for all human endeavor, actually. I mean, Freud, following Nietzsche, formulated the idea that civilization is based on renunciation of instincts. And in this, all culture, in a sense, is ascetical. Mm-hmm. So the broad definitions both point to a shared disposition among individuals to ascetic behavior. And in this view, the ascetic impulse is a transcultural one. A certain level of ascetic self-denial is always necessary for cultural functioning. And so asceticism includes any disciplined, goal-directed behavior in the service of social formation. But whereas broad definitions are included within the framework of asceticism, practices that go beyond the religious contexts, specifically narrower definitions of asceticism are situated always within a specifically religious tradition. So in a religious context, asceticism involves a voluntary, sustained, and systematic program of self-discipline and self-denial intended to facilitate a process of self-transformation so as to attain a religious goal and a higher, more spiritual plane of existence. And asceticism comes from the Greek for practice, training. So I will use the expression ascetic training, but actually it is a tautology. So asceticism is training. Yeah.
Commonly applied to the training of athletes or soldiers in the Greco-Roman world, correct?
Exactly. And then in the Hellenistic period, having been interiorized to refer to internal exercises of the mind and soul.
Okay. So with that in mind, you bring up, in your introduction, you talk about the history of scholarship, really starting with Peter Brown, who's kind of the, he's just a huge figure, and from him, so much work has been done in Christian asceticism. But the emphasis there was always on the body and the training of the body and the importance of the body. And you make it a point in your introduction, you don't say that's wrong, you don't say it's unhelpful, but you say the training of the mind often gets neglected. But the mind was such an important concept for the subjects you're studying. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you decided to focus on mind instead of body?
Yes, sure. Well, asceticism actually combines two systems of training, usually, a physical and a mental one, each of which has its own different set of exercises, and they usually go together other than just one of them. Scholars of asceticism have focused on the ascetic body and on the role of bodily asceticism in promoting self-transformation. And in contrast, the system of purely mental training that helped to attain this goal has not received due attention, I think. And in my book, I argue that the need for the need to broaden the emphasis on the ascetic body and to consider the role of mental training in ascetic processes of self-formation. And this neglect may partly derive from the fact that asceticism is ultimately indeed expressed in the body and in bodily practices, but reading the Egyptian and Palestinian sources, I could clearly see that the problem that these monks sought to address was ultimately rooted not in the body, but in the mind's failure to exercise control over the body, over the inner processes of the mind and body. And ascetic training was centered around this attempt to gain such a control of the body over the inner processes. So the form of asceticism on which I chose to focus involves a disciplined and systematic effort to train attention to purify the mind. And I argue that this form of asceticism, ascetic training, assisted Christian ascetics in the process of creating new psychological capacities and exceptional cognitive skills, all in the service of contemplation, of course. As to the notions that Peter Brown made popular in his 1971 publication, The Rise and Function of the Holy Man, of the Christian Holy Man, and in later publications. I mean, I think, in fact, Brown himself is one of the most influential figures for me. And during my doctoral studies, I had the honor even of meeting him and presenting my research to him. I think Brown himself repeatedly points beyond the body. He's well aware of the psychological dimensions of asceticism. But perhaps the trend that came later sometimes simplifies things and ignores other aspects. And what I I find problematic is that the body has become a kind of a catchword, a kind of a trend, on the expense of other, no less important dimensions of asceticism. But I do want to stress that I did not have any polemical intentions, not on this issue or on other ones. I approached the texts themselves, the monastic texts were more important to me than the theories and ideas that I read elsewhere. And I just wanted to do justice to what I found in these texts. So this was the intention.
Yeah, well, it's certainly hard to argue with Peter Brown. I mean, he's done so much. He's such a great scholar. And I also think that you brought it up quite nicely. His project wasn't to focus on the body to the exclusion of everything else. But I think what he was trying to do was to say, hey, these early Christian ascetics weren't so negative, or they didn't just reject the body outright. It was a very complicated matter. And he looked at, in his Body and Society, he actually looks at all these different regions of the Mediterranean world and how they approach questions of the body differently, to show that it wasn't just this kind of body spirit dualism that, you know, rejected the body. I always thought that was one of his main projects, and I thought he did a nice job of highlighting the value of the body for these people. But we're not here to talk about Peter Brown. We're here to talk about you. So, okay. Now, how did you come up with the idea to read these monastic sources? Well, maybe first we could talk about your selection of sources, because you stick with Egyptian monasticism, Palestinian monasticism, so the Holy Land and Gaza, but you don't go into too much on the Syriac side. You do a little bit, but no Cappadocians, no Rule of Saint Benedict. What was your reasoning there?
Yeah. Well, at the most general level, although this does not have any direct bearing on my choice to focus on the Egyptian and Palestinian monasticism, but it is relevant because I was born and raised in the Middle East, and I have a personal acquaintance with its deserts. They're not a different world for me, but actually a personal experience, not so fearful as it might seem to someone who's never been to a desert. But more to the point, I wanted not only or not primarily to say something general about asceticism, but to say something specific about a specific historical and spiritual context with all its rich details. And to give such a thick description as possible to this specific context, to be able to provide this depth contextualization, I needed to limit my corpus. And Egyptian and Palestinian monasticism is a clearly delineated and a tradition where we know how ideas were transferred and delivered and transformed. So it's a comfortable choice to work with. But having said that, if I wrote it today, I would broaden the scope to give more attention to Syriac adaptations of the Egyptian traditions. And also go longer on a longer time scale to see these developments, which I'm working on now. So it's a continuation.
Okay, very good. And you know, the sources, there's something about Egyptian and Palestinian monasticism that the nature of the sources seem to lend themselves to this kind of a project, because on the one hand, you have the major theorists. You have Evagrius, who's doing monastic theology, and his predecessor, Origen, primarily. But with Cassian and with Barsanuphius and John and with the Apophthegmata Patrum, you have correspondences, or you have young monks confronting elders with questions that really get at the concrete issues they were dealing with. And you bring that out nicely in your book, how these things, how these correspondences reflect the kinds of real life problems that these monks are dealing with. So why, I shouldn't ask why, but how did you come up with the idea that cognitive neuroscience, today advances in cognitive neuroscience, can help us to think about the problems that these early monks were facing?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a bit long and complicated answer, but generally, again, to begin with, not being raised in a Christian environment. And I think I had a kind of freedom and privilege of approaching these texts relatively as a blank slate. They were not loaded for me with any specific moral or religious or theological meaning. At the most basic level, I could come to these texts really receptive and just listen to them and without any preconceived ideas. This is how I worked. I really came to these texts for a year or even more. I just, okay, let me begin by saying these texts were extremely strange to me when I first met them. It was in more even than a decade ago in an MA seminar on asceticism. And then I met all this, plus I studied many years literature, comparative literature, both BA and MA and even more. And then I came to these texts and they were full of monks fighting demons, holy men doing miracles and so on. And so I was struck by how strange how they were, how the behaviors they describe reminded me of nothing I knew. So what was the truth value? How should I treat these texts? So then came a long process, really long, for a year or more. I just read many theories, from anthropology to psychoanalysis and literary criticism and so on. I read everything and things were interesting and relevant, but only when I arrived to cognitive theories about thinking and intrusive thoughts and attention and its cognitive underpinnings, only then did I had this eureka moment. Really, this is the exactly right key to the exactly right door, and really details came to fit together, to make sense together. Even the smallest details in the monastic sources could mostly fit into this broad framework. So it was a matter of working bottom up, of trying what may best suit you. And I think this is my best advice for anyone working on historical texts, to try to work bottom up, to begin with not to begin with theories, with great ideas, but work with the text and then go search what helps best to understand them.
Yeah. You know, I was working on a master's degree in theology a long time ago, not quite 20 years ago. And that's when I first came across the Monks of the Desert, taking Columbus Stewart's classes on asceticism and monasticism. And I found a lot of striking similarities with what the monks were saying and with what cognitive behaviorists were saying. And some stuff happened at that time that led me to leave the program. And I worked in the mental health field for a little while. And I was starting to think maybe I'll pursue a advanced degree in clinical psychology. So I did a research assistantship in the psychiatry department at the University of Minnesota, and I was involved in a treatment study for comorbid anxiety and alcohol use. And I started to get familiar with the literature on anxiety disorders and phobias, their causes, their treatments. And this got me into questions about cognitive neuroscience and how thoughts and emotions and behaviors affect each other, and the different models of conditioning and fear extinction through exposure therapy. And I was thinking about this the entire time I was reading your book. There's a great center, it's at Boston University. It's called, if it's still there, it's been a long, long time now, over 10 years. It was called like the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders. And the guy who ran it was David Barlow. And he had a team of clinicians, and they would do treatment studies on anxiety disorders and phobias and OCD that you kind of bring up a little bit in your book. And they used an experimental medication. It wasn't experimental, it was experimental for this use, but it was an old medication used to treat tuberculosis called dicyclosarin. And what they found was that this medication served as like a stimulant in a way for glutamate receptors in the brain that affected memory formation. And so through habitual training, exposure therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, there were some promising results that this medication would actually help in the formation of new memories. So like you go to an exposure session, you're afraid of heights or something like that, and you go stand in a high bridge or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so they were toying around with different ways of applying this medication. Do you do it before? Do you do it after? How long? Which way? But it got some positive results. And I haven't looked into the science since then, probably since like 2010 or 2011, maybe. But I thought this really confirms a lot of stuff of what you're saying, not the use of a medication, but that through repeated practice and habituation, our brain still can change and can alter. And it does help to make a lot of sense about the kinds of transformations that these early monks were going through and the problems that they experienced doing it, which your book brings out. So I might be something worth looking into. I don't know if you'd be interested in that, but that was what I was thinking while I'm reading your book.
I do think that many, I mean, really, I can name several therapies of modern times that have a lot of basic elements that the monastic therapies also have. And indeed, the therapy of cognitive behavioral therapy, the founder of this was influenced by Stoic ideas of cognitive framing and reframing and so on. So I think it would have, I mean, modern psychology had to invent all this all over again, anew. But being in touch with its tradition and with different religious traditions and philosophical traditions could have made it much easier to adopt ideas and to not having to invent things out of the blue. And you talked about exposure therapy, which many times when I read the monastic therapies, it did remind me specifically of exposure therapies, which are today very effective. I know in the case of OECD, they're very effective, but the problem is that it's so difficult to face, to be exposed, that there is a large dropout rate. But the ideological frame that the monastic movement gave motivation, much stronger motivation than modern therapies can rely on, can expect their patients to have. So the principles are sometimes similar, but the religious framework gave such a different therapeutic effectivity to everything. So this exchange needs to be done very carefully and to see effectivity in different contexts.
Yes, okay. So now maybe, so we've got some of the preliminaries done, and I want to get to some of like the main ideas, like as you flesh them out in your book. One of them is self-control, enkratia. Can you talk a little bit about that? That was really, you make the point here that a lot of these things are really struggles about self-control.
Yeah. Let me begin by saying that I think scholars, historians specifically, are sometimes deterred or see a danger in adopting this practical approach, which begins with the actual practices rather than with ideas and cultural context and so on. I think this is one of the reasons why relatively not much has been written on this context of self-control in Christian asceticism. But again, my work is praxis-oriented. It begins with the practices, with the actual details we find in the monastic sources, and then works up in order to understand them. And when I encountered these texts, it was clear that self-control is for them an important aspect, not something that I'm imposing on them. The notion of self-control, it played an important role in Christianity from its very beginning, but it acquired special importance in an ascetic monastic context. And it was accorded indeed a central role in the early monastic thought and practice. So self-control is the basic faculty that allows individuals to alter their thinking and behavior. So it seemed to me that it's clearly relevant to my attempt to understand the ascetic process of self-transformation, since this is my emphasis here. And more specifically, self-control is the capacity to override automatic and habitual behaviors, emotions, and so on. And these behaviors would otherwise interfere with long-term goals. I think all this doesn't help to explain the experience of the late antique monks in any way, but it helps us to approach what they did and start thinking about it from the bottom up.
Okay.
So, self-control is also a key aspect of asceticism and the key to the self-transformation process that takes place in asceticism. And in particular, in Egyptian and Palestinian monasticism, on which I focus, there is special importance to capacity to control the mind and attention. So there are different kinds or areas of self-control, and today in psychology, controlling attention or mental control is considered the most important and basic one, because when you control your attention, it's the key to controlling behaviors and emotions and so on.
That's right.
So attention, and I think that the monks understood this. I think that they understood really well the importance of attention in a world where you have no much influence on the external circumstances, and you can only change yourself to adjust even, or to adjust to changing conditions. I think they were very sensitive to the how this can be done and to the important role of attention in this process. So in view of this, the central role accorded in monastic sources to this kind of control, I thought that this perspective can help to reconstruct the actual ups and downs that monks encountered in their daily life. So this was like the key to me to how to try to build my towers over these practical aspects.
So there's an assumption.
And yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No. So I said the main points. Yeah.
Okay. So there's an assumption underpinning the monks' thinking on this, and that is that they actually can achieve a form of self-control, that this is something that was within their power. And I wanted to read a little passage that you quote from Origins on First Principles on page 82 of your book that somewhat sets out the theory that at least the brand of monks you're looking at follows. And it says, quote, this is from book 3, chapter 3, paragraph 4 on First Principles. A man receives the energy, that is, the working of a good spirit, when he is stirred and incited to good. The soul is moved by the presence of a better spirit, that is, if it encounters no perturbation or alienation of mind, whatever, from the impending inspiration, nor lose the free control of its will. By the suggestions of good spirits, the memory of man is aroused to the recollection of better things. So he's talking about the effects of the good spirits, but he also talks about the effects of the demons and everything. But really what he's saying is the control of the self means managing these different influences and determining which ones are. So he's really getting into this later practice of the discernment of spirits, you know, which ones are from good sources, which ones are from bad sources, and this and that. That seems to set out anyway the philosophical framework for the monastic quest for self-control and attentiveness. Would you kind of agree with that?
I think this quotation for me brings an important point of the of whether or not we should or the boundary between self-agency and counting on divine agency.
Yes.
So we in the modern conception of agency assumes that autonomy and self-sufficiency stand in opposition to agency of supernatural powers. But in late antiquity, these and in Origins quote, it's clearly there. In this thinking, these notions are understood within the context that presumes the existence of spiritual, supernatural powers. So it doesn't make any sense to draw a distinction and to say that there is no notion of freedom, free will, and self-agency because of this reliance on divine powers. So this is the basic idea for me that's relevant for my development of these ideas. And in such a world, humans are inevitably instruments of external agents. So self-agency stands in relation to one's ability to reject the world and to submit oneself to divine agency. And there is a lot of space for freedom here. So these ideas are not contradictory at all, I think.
Yeah, and as he says in book 3, chapter, I think it's 312 maybe, we can't blame things that happen to us externally because it's in the mind, or the hegemonikon, he uses that Stoic concept, hegemonikon, where we process this information. So this quote here that I just read is really saying that we are in control of how we respond to these stimuli. And you bring that up in your book. For the monks, the thought in and of itself, whether it's good or bad, is not responsible for the monk's behavior. It's the credence they give to it that really is where sin or virtue come from.
Yeah, and let me mention in this context that the demons also adjust their strategies to the internal condition of the monk. So this is a beautiful and quite insightful and sophisticated, I think, combination of external causation and the internal reaction, which maintains both ends of this complexity without giving up on any of them. Combines them in a quite convincing way, I think.
You're bringing up causality. I think that's absolutely right, because these were major philosophical debates going on at the time. So in some ways, and I had Robin Darling-Young on here a while back to talk about Evagrius. And so much of hers, she's trying to suggest that Evagrius is grappling with Plotinus and Porphyry's ideas. So in some way, in the monastic world, are we seeing play out the practical aspect of philosophical problems, like applying these theories of causation into practice? I don't know, that just popped into my head right now, but there might be something there.
I do think reality is part of their reactions to these theoretical ideas. It's a combination of both, yes. Ideas will always be suited to the reality that the monks lived, and not just accepted as I mean, the monks will combine these ideas, will connect them to their lives, and then interpret them in this context. And I think it's true what you were saying about this connection. Yeah.
I want to move on. Barsanuphius and John play a major role in your book, and I find some of their correspondences so fascinating, because on the one hand, you kind of get a sense that Barsanuphius and John get quite impatient with some of their disciples asking the same questions over and over again. But there's a really good one, really good exchange you bring up that demonstrates the problems of trying to control attention. And so I'll just read from page 101. This is a disciple of Barsanuphius. Whenever I am in some place where there are relics of holy martyrs, which is an interesting historical point right there, that by this time they're already kind of venerating the relics, a thought troubles me. And we're going to get to this part later too, because this is a fascinating chapter. The thought troubles me so that I want to approach and venerate them many times. And whenever I pass by them, my thought suggests that I should bow my head. So, Barsanuphius. Now, so he's having some problems. Should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? Here's Barsanuphius's response. This is just great. The demons cause this in order to lead us to despondency and carelessness. They bring disturbance to our vigilance, forcing us to do something inopportunely. Indeed, when we see our thought performing the cross with joy, neither on account of cowardice, nor on account of any other disturbance, then we should understand this as occurring with godly fear. For what we do voluntarily is certainly pleasing to God. Now, this seems like from Barsanuphius just a good piece of practical advice, but he's really responding to a profound insight, psychological insight that this other monk of his was dealing with. Can you talk a little bit about that? This is just such a great story.
Yes, I think the demons were therapeutically very effective in several ways. One of them, the other, I mentioned some of them in my book, but the ones apparent in this quotation is that, and I mean today too, there are new therapies designed to help OCD patients understand that their obsessive thinking should not be identified with themselves. They're part of pathological brain mechanisms and so on. These are the official therapies. But when you look at the internet, you see many sites of people suffering from OCD just writing their blogs and so on. And many of them, not necessarily Christians even, have found that treating their OCD as a demon, specifically as a demon, is very effective for them. And there are quite a lot of online sites, including recommendations to personify your OCD, to see it as a hostile stranger, other than identifying with it as something that comes out of you. And people who write this say how effective this is. So that it was very effective, and Barsanuphius makes like a brilliant use of, and he's very sensitive to the occasions when it should be ascribed to the demon, and responsibility should be relieved from the disciple, and when it shouldn't, when it is the fault of the disciple, even if the demon is involved. So he has a different answer for every question, specifically because of the different utilities of how to use the demons and personal responsibility and how to combine them. And this approach shows that the disciple is doing like a very recommended thing to worship the relics. But Barsanuphius recognizes that this is done not in a natural way, in a stressful way, in a compulsive way. So he uses the demon to say that this is the demon causing you to do this. And I wonder how effective this was, because we didn't have another correspondence saying whether this was effective or not. But I think it could be very effective.
Yeah, Barsanuphius didn't do any follow-up studies to give us any empirical data.
Exactly.
But it's such an important point. He says, look, if the thought that you're having is troubling you, then maybe that's not a good angel that's provoking it. Maybe it's a demon that's doing this to lead you into despair. Whereas if you get joy from it, that is kind of a sign that, okay, this is a good thing. This is an angel or maybe God himself. So it's really the discernment of spirits, and it's trying to figure out
the quote you quoted earlier from Origin.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So okay, I really thought that was a great one, a great example. Now, and it kind of gets into, you talk a little bit about misguided asceticism in your book too, and you suggest that some of the monks, when these strategies fail, some of the elders will ascribe it to laziness or something like that, negligence. But you even say, well, cognitive science tells us that sometimes misguided practices can have unintended consequences. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your book?
Just one note about the former question, just before I address this one. I think it might be helpful to treat the letters of Barsanuphius and John. They were, for me, very methodologically helpful because of the nature of the other texts, like the Apophthegmata, Patrum, and so on, which are made of different levels, layers, and so on, and the reliability is questioned on some points. So it was very helpful to me to use the correspondence of Parthenopeus as a kind of control group. If I meet some kind of, if I read something in their letters, then I can quite reasonably think that when it appears elsewhere, it has a historical basis.
Yes.
So a methodological note. So about your question of misguided asceticism. Well, I use this term, as you said, to refer to various kinds of misuse of the recommended ascetic strategies. And drawing on monastic reports of such cases of problems and misuses, I found that the ascetic strategies could be misused in various ways. And there's not much written about it in historical literature. They could be misused just, as you said, out of laziness or such reasons. But on many occasions, it was misused out of the best of intentions, out of overzealousness and too intensive use and so on. But actually, this was one of the hardest parts for me to theorize in my work. To understand that what I'm seeing here is a misuse of the strategies, or how to treat it, how to theorize about these problems that I see in the texts. And actually what helped me to theorize this in this way, I mean, cognitive science helped me to understand the problems I'm reading about. So repeated thoughts and so on, why does this happen? But what helped me theorize about this being misguided asceticism was really the literature, the traditional literature of Tibetan, Chinese medicine, and other Asian religious and meditative traditions. And the literature on of these traditions records the potential complications that can arise from systematic mental training, as well as the causes, symptoms, and treatment for these occasions. For example, in traditional Tibetan and Chinese medicine, complications that arise from misguided meditation are a recognized hazard. I mean, for us, it's not well known, but for them, it's a traditional recognized hazard. Even in the DSM, in the fifth current version of the DSM, there is a part of culturally dependent syndromes, which I think problems with Tai Chi appear there, or some other culture-dependent meditation, misguided meditation use. So I found out that this literature lends valuable insight into the practical challenges that Christian monks encountered. And this phenomena, as I said, has rarely been observed in the scholarship on Christian monasticism. And I think it is because I adopted a praxis-oriented approach to asceticism rather than beginning with some grand theory, that I could give this phenomena its due attention and recognize its prevalence. Because these are small details that you really have to be attentive to notice them and to see that they're prevalent enough to be a phenomenon. And so this, for me, brings out again the importance of cross-cultural and multidisciplinary perspective. This is, I think, the only way to gain full appreciation of all the dimensions and the details and the richness of any historical corpus, but specifically the monastic one.
In the quest for getting control over the mind, you bring this up, and I think this is 100% right. The more we try to think about, what is it? If somebody tells you don't think about a bear, you're actually going to be thinking about a bear. You bring that study up, I think, in your book. Mm-hmm. And Evagrius seems to be dealing with a very similar problem when he writes on page 121, you have this great quote here. A custom of the demons is after impure thoughts to instill thoughts of anxiety and a multitude of mental representations in the mind. Choked by the thorns of anxiety, our efforts are rendered fruitless. As an athlete will be hindered by his tunic, so also will the mind be easily dragged about by thoughts of anxiety. So the monk trying to purify the mind does these mental exercises but they often get tripped up doing that if their mind starts to go off in different places. And Evagrius seems to be kind of responding to that here, and says this is an act, this is a work of the demons. And it's kind of like a downward spiral that just gets worse the more the one thinks about it.
And I think in the quote from Barsanuppius, that the quote you brought earlier also, I think monastic elders were very much aware of the detrimental effects of anxiety.
Yeah.
Often the geniusness of their therapies was its simplicity, just coping with the anxiety part of the equation. And then the problem is solved, which on first glance on these sources might seem as a miracle, as something incredible, or just to beautify how things went. But once you understand the mechanism and how anxiety indeed can cause these detrimental effects, you see how sophisticated and insightful these therapies was. These were really experienced therapists and sensitive persons.
Yep. So, okay. So I sent you all these notes that I had, and there's a lot. We're not going to be able to get to all of them just because of the time. But there is one that I really wanted to get into because it's got me thinking a lot, actually. At first, I was a little skeptical. But after I thought about it, I was like, you might be onto something. And this is the grammatical point you make. And I think it's your final chapter. And we just saw a glimpse of it in one of the previous quotes I read, where when they talk about these thoughts, they talk about it as if the thought is the agent of the action and the person is the passive recipient. The thought troubles me. The thought tells me to do. What does that tell us then about monastic asceticism, the training of the mind, and therapies for it? It's a wonderful chapter.
Yeah. Well, it took me a long time to understand this, but at first it just seemed a bit strange, this phrasing, but then it is repeated over and over again, and going to this control group of Barsanuppius and John's correspondence, you can even trace the exact occasions when this phrasing is being used and when other phrasings are being used. For example, when the spiritual teacher talks, he may use I think, and not the passive phrasing of the thought tells me.
That's right.
But this is in specific context. So you see that this is not first accidental. There is some logic to how this language is being used. Then when, again, I had to devote like a lot of time to understanding what this means and how this could be effective. And this is not just a convenient way or some unique way to talk about language, but that it has an effect and a goal. And to me, it shows just how every means was used in the service of promoting this transformation, even the language. So I think by phrasing and repeating all the time that the monks said the thought tells me or the thought wants me and so on, this passive phrasing, and it was repeated all along by verbalizing their thoughts to their spiritual father. So I think gradually this kind of language made a change in how monks approach their own thoughts, and not so much different than ascribing them to demons, but an additional way to make this effect even stronger, perhaps. So a way of bringing about a therapeutic shift, I may say, in understanding of the self and its relations to its thoughts. Because being emotionally connected to one's thoughts is a basic bias of all people. And it is also the root of the problem of maintaining the monk's old subjectivity that needed to be transformed in order to approach to God, to open one's heart to God. It was the barrier that stood in the way. So I think this language, again, was able to change habits, to change ways of thinking, and theories of linguistic theories of linguistic relativity and how language can impact experience helped me to understand the therapeutic effectivity of this procedure.
So I have two things to say on this, and one is just to reflect on one of your uses then of modern cognitive neuroscience. And this is where you apply the concept inverted experiential construction to kind of explain what's going on. And that part seems to make sense. The other thing I wanted to say was that, you know, this is a very standard practice of things like cognitive behavior therapy, where in a way, as a means of help getting a patient, you know, out of the quagmire of their own thoughts, they're taught to treat the thoughts as if they are an external observer watching them. And that creates a distance between the subject, the person, and then the object being scrutinized. And you say, well, that's really kind of, the monks are training themselves to do that. That's the mental habits that they're trying to develop.
And I think it's a complementary therapy to the mindfulness techniques or the Wagerian contemplative techniques to distance oneself from one's thoughts as a way to spiritual development. So I think we're talking on these strategies as different parts, but they were really in an organic whole, very effective organic whole that used every available means as a method to be harnessed to this project. And this is one example, I think both the language and the cognitive strategies were all part of this whole strategy.
Okay, great. Well, we're closing in on an hour, and I know you said that you couldn't go much past the hour, and that you had some questions for me.
Yeah, I'd love to know how you yourself, the intersection between how you find my work relevant to your work, because I see you're working specifically or especially on biblical interpretation and patristic theology, and not on these practical so much aspects that I'm talking about. So I just love to hear how it was relevant to you.
Well, so most of my work is on origin so far. I'm going to have to branch out eventually, but right now origin is my topic. And biblical interpretation, I've focused so much on methods of interpretation. So grammar, the philosophical reading practice he engaged. But I'm applying for postdocs now, and what I really want to look at is how Origen's theology of the heart, what kind of implications that has for the Christian reader, because the heart was probably the most important category for Origen. And you know as well as I do that what he does and what the monks did, the heart wasn't how we think of the heart today. I'm not talking about cardiovascular organ. But when we tell somebody you'll have a heart, we're telling them to be kind or something like that, be compassionate. But for Origen, the heart was the governing part, both of the body. The physical organ was the governing part of the body. The spiritual organ, heart, or the hegemonikon, or the nous, or the dianoidikon, that was the governing part of the soul. And that is where, following the Stoics, that is where impressions and perceptions kind of clash, and the person then processes this information and then chooses rationally how to act upon them. So this is like the moral psychology that Origen takes kind of from the Stoics. And when he talks about reading, well, on the one hand, he'll use Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, as a paradigm, on the one hand, for homonymy. The same word, meaning, what is it? The same word meaning different things. And so the heart, he says, when it's used in the Bible, is often used as this interior organ. It's not the bodily organ. And when he applies that, he's normally trying to get his audience to say, look beyond the mere letter of the text, because if you get stuck with that, you're going to be distracted from what's really important.
Mm-hmm.
And then he combines it with, at the time of prayer, he's got this notion, that it's at the time of prayer when the demons really attack, and they kind of instigate all these fantasia, and memories. And so I do think that there's a connection there between the purity of heart and Christian reading practice, which is kind of like my big thing that I want to do now, because Origen's fundamentally trying to get his audience to become good readers of the Bible and to know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to know how to do it, they need to know how to train their mind, their heart, to interact with the subject matter of the scriptures, which is the logos being mediated to them. And so, and for him, of course, the mind is the part of the body, the part of us, the human being, that has its kinship with God, because God is pure intellectual being. Our intellect, it comes from that. So that's where we have our connection with the divine. So purifying that puts us in a position where we can have that immediate, maybe not immediate, but that mediated encounter with the logos in the reading of the scriptures. And that requires for Origen a great deal of training, great deal of mental training. And in his homilies, he's really giving his audience, I think, in some regards, a fundamental philosophical education in the basics of physics. The material world is good, but we have to be able to look beyond that to see the one who causes the material world to do what it does. So that's kind of, plus I'm just interested in Egyptian monasticism and how they train the mind and the heart, because it always strikes me that these monks are dealing with real life circumstances. I mean, not just like the mental thoughts that come, but so much of their problems deal with, how do I relate to this brother next door who's pissing me off all the time? And so,
I think Origen too is combining his personal experience in his writings about prayer. It's obvious that he encountered in himself some problems in this area. So
100%. I mean, if you read his treatise on prayer, you will see so much of what's going on in the desert, I think. So yeah, that's why I got your book, because in my dissertation, I have a chapter, I think it's my final chapter, where I deal with how Origen is trying to cultivate a reader, a Christian reader. And that's where I really bring in his theology of the heart and how he's trying to get his audience to train their heart to see scripture in a certain way.
Yeah, and it took Vagarius to translate all this to really practical ways of living and
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And then of course John Cashin, always afraid to use the term apatheia. He tends to use purity of heart instead, but I think for both of them they mean something quite similar.
This is actually what I'm working on now. How these monastic ideas whether apatheia can be conceptualized as psychological health or mental health today, and if we equate between modern notions of what the state means and monastic notions, and how much more optimistic these monastic notions of how much you can aspire, how high you can aspire to improve yourself, to change yourself, much more optimistic than we have today. Although today we have neuroscience to tell us that we do indeed, we did aspire very high in ourselves to a large degree, but still we're much more pessimistic today. And I'm wondering if it takes necessarily a theological basis in order to aspire so high, or do we have any alternative ideology that can help us search and take such an ambitious goal? But basically what I'm interested now in, what I did in my dissertation is to bring modern science to understand the ancient texts. What I'm trying to do now is to bring the ancient texts to see how they can contribute insights, psychology and psychiatry today, critical thinking and both techniques and therapies.
Well, I certainly think, as a historical theologian, I think theology always has a place. So I'm biased in that regard. But I do think too, I've also been, so my dissertation was on biblical interpretation and reading practices. But I've gotten more interested in other theological, philosophical things too. Reading John Rist is a book, What is a Person? And that's got me thinking about how these ancient Christian anthropologies, what they can contribute to our understanding of the human being today, which seems to be falling into disrepair. Very atomistic view of the human person today, I think. In light of your comment, yeah, there is a certain degree of optimism, isn't there, that they thought that through training, and they would also say, you know, with the military aid of divine grace, but they also they're also realists in a way too. They realize that this transformation is limited given our current state of affairs as human beings.
Yeah.
So we can't become perfect here and now. We can't change ourselves into perfection here. We can't change the world to become a perfect place. We have limitations. But within those limitations, the possibilities for them are actually quite optimistic in certain ways.
Yeah. In modern research on optimism, there is a distinction between a delusional optimism and realistic optimism. Yeah. And I do think that, that this view belongs to the realistic optimism.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think their emphasis on the intellect, I mean, there are problems with it from theological anthropology. You know, if you position the mind as the part of, like, rationality as being, you know, that is what we are in the image of, that the image is not the body for them, it's the intellect. And of course that comes with certain problems too, because then what do you do with people who have intellectual disabilities? Because if rationality is the highest form of human being, well, then what do you do with someone with Downs or something like that who doesn't have that capacity? But even with that aside, I do think that there is something there, something in this emphasis on the intellect and on our rationality that can really at least complement, if not even improve, the anthropologies that focus on the body.
And let's not forget that the whole idea of man being in divine image is the basis of modern humanism.
That's right. That's right.
So it is still the basis of medical care in some way or another today. Yeah. So I do think we need urgently even to make ourselves as historians, as theologians, as humanities scholars relevant to what's going on today. I think this is what we all should be working on, adding an additional step to our work, which looks like we do our historical and theoretical work, and then we see what are the implications for society. I think this is a responsibility that every humanities scholar should take upon himself or herself.
You know, I think that might be a great way to close, although you have a copy of your book with you?
I do, yeah.
Would you mind reading a little bit to close out? You have to find it. I have it right here.
I have to leave in 10 minutes, so I went home.
I just want to read a paragraph. Would that be okay to close it out? Okay.
Yeah, great.
I think it gets to kind of like what you had just said so beautifully there. This is from your conclusion. The preceding chapters have uncovered both the risks inherent in the attempt to impose remote possibilities on reality, as well as the benefits that might be gained from this endeavor. In the words attributed to one of the fathers, quote, "Know the good life by experience and do not fear it as something impossible," end quote. Ascetic practitioners who were willing to take the risk, a willingness that made them worthy of divine aid, were able to push human nature to the limits of its capacity and beyond. In the words of John Climacus, this process involved a, quote, "denial of nature for the attainment of what is above nature," end quote. The resurfacing of this insight in contemporary neuroscience enables us to appreciate the optimistic, yet realistic nature of the monastic vision of human potential. In turn, this optimistic vision of the extent to which human capacities can be improved, which far exceeds the goals of modern psychological therapies, offers an opportunity for a reflection on the tacit anthropological assumptions underlying contemporary Western psychology. The vast potential for transdisciplinary dialogue across history, theology, psychology, and the cognitive science remains to be explored. End quote.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing now these days.
Inbar, thank you so much for coming on Patristicast. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did as well.
I did. Thank you very much for inviting me, John. I enjoyed it.
Okay.